Anderson Cooper spent his life reporting on tragedy, wars, hurricanes, earthquakes, families standing in ruins, trying to understand how one day destroyed everything. But the tragedy that shaped Anderson Cooper most was not one he covered for television. It was the one inside his own family. In 1988, his older brother, Carter Vanderbilt Cooper, died at only 23 years old. Carter was the son of Gloria Vanderbilt, one of the most famous women in American society. He was also connected to the Vanderbilt name, a name tied to railroads, mansions, old money, and a level of privilege most people can barely imagine. From the outside, Carter looked like someone life had protected. He had the family name. He had education. He had intelligence. He had access. He had a mother who loved him. He had a younger brother who would spend the rest of his life remembering him. But none of it was enough. That is the part of Carter Cooper's story that still feels impossible to explain. Because this is not simply a story about money failing to buy happiness. That lesson is too small. This is a story about something more painful. A person can be surrounded by love, comfort, history, and opportunity, and still be unreachable in the one place that matters most: his own mind. Anderson Cooper would later become known for his calm voice in the middle of other people's worst days. But before the cameras, before CNN, before the war zones and disaster sites, Anderson had already learned something terrible. Loss does not always arrive with a warning. Sometimes it enters a family that looks safe. Sometimes it walks into a home filled with books, art, memory, and money. Sometimes it takes the person everyone thought still had a future. Carter was not a public figure like his mother. He was not a famous journalist like his younger brother would become. He was, first of all, a son, a brother, the young man whose life should have continued into decades of work, love, mistakes, growth, and ordinary aging. Instead, his name became attached to one terrible question. Why? Why did this happen to him? Why could no one stop it? Why did a family with so much love still lose someone they loved so deeply? That question never truly left Anderson, and it never truly left Gloria Vanderbilt either. For the public, Carter's death became a tragic chapter in a famous family's history. But for the people who loved him, it was not a chapter, it was a wound. And to understand that wound, we cannot begin with the Vanderbilt fortune. We have to begin with the family before it broke. Because before Carter Cooper died young, before Anderson Cooper became the surviving brother, before Gloria Vanderbilt became a mother carrying the worst memory of her life, there was another loss: a father. A husband, a man named Wyatt Cooper, and when he was gone, something inside that family changed forever. Before Carter Vanderbilt Cooper became a tragedy people tried to explain, he was a son. And to understand the son, we have to understand the father. Wyatt Cooper did not come from the same world as Gloria Vanderbilt. He was not born into old American wealth. He did not carry a last name that belonged to mansions, railroads, and society pages. He came from a different background. He became a writer, an actor, and a man known for a quiet kind of emotional strength. To the public, he was Gloria Vanderbilt's husband. Inside the family, he appears to have been something much more important. He was the steady one. For Gloria, that mattered deeply. Her early life had been marked by public attention, family conflict, and emotional instability. She had known what it meant to be rich and still unsafe. She had known what it meant to be watched by strangers before she was old enough to understand why. Wyatt seemed to offer something fame and money had never given her: warmth, safety, a sense of being loved without performance. And for Carter and Anderson, Wyatt was not just a father connected to a famous mother. He was the person who gave the family its center. This matters because families are not held together only by money, houses, or shared names. They are held together by the person who makes a room feel safe, the person who lowers the tension, the person who turns a famous household into a home. By public accounts, Wyatt Cooper was thoughtful, literary, and emotionally present. He understood that children need more than opportunity. They need steadiness. They need someone who sees them before the world starts measuring them. For Carter, that kind of father may have mattered more than outsiders could understand. Because Carter was not growing up in an ordinary family. He was growing up beneath a name that came with history attached to it. Vanderbilt was not just a surname, it was a symbol. It carried glamour, expectation, curiosity, and judgment. People thought they knew what that name meant before they knew the person carrying it. Wyatt may have helped make that weight feel human. Then, in January of 1978, he was gone. Wyatt Cooper died during heart surgery at the age of 50. Carter was 13, Anderson was 10. There are ages when the loss of a parent does not simply hurt. It changes the shape of a child's life. 13 is old enough to understand death, but it is still young enough to need the person who made the world feel stable. 10 is young enough for the loss to become part of your personality before you even know how to describe it. From the outside, the family still had the Vanderbilt name. They still had beauty, money, social access, and public fascination. But inside, something essential had been removed. Gloria lost the husband who had given her peace. Carter and Anderson lost the father who had helped define safety. The home that once had a center now had an absence. And sometimes, the first loss does not end when the funeral is over. Sometimes, it keeps echoing quietly through every room a family enters afterward. The Vanderbilt name was never just a name. In America, it carried the sound of railroads, steamships, mansions, and old power. Long before Carter Vanderbilt Cooper was born, that name had already become part of the country's imagination. It began with Cornelius Vanderbilt, the man history would remember as the Commodore. He built his fortune first through shipping, then through railroads. By the time he died in the 19th century, the Vanderbilt name had become one of the clearest symbols of American success. But a famous name does something strange. It does not belong only to the person carrying it. It belongs to strangers too. People hear Vanderbilt, and they think they already understand the life behind it. They imagine marble staircases, private schools, old money, beautiful rooms, a life protected from ordinary pain. And that is where the danger begins. Because when the world believes you have everything, it becomes harder for the world to imagine that you might be suffering. It may even become harder for you to admit it. Carter was not simply born into a family. He was born into a story that had been written before he arrived. The story said Vanderbilt meant privilege. Vanderbilt meant access. Vanderbilt meant beauty, education, and rooms most people would never enter. But a family legacy can be both inheritance and burden. It can open doors in public while creating silence in private. It can give a young person a place in history before he has even had time to understand himself. It can make outsiders see a symbol instead of a son. That is why Carter's story cannot be reduced to wealth. The wealth makes the tragedy more complicated, not less, because it exposes one of the most common mistakes people make about pain. People often believe suffering must be justified by visible hardship. If someone is poor, lonely, rejected, or publicly broken, the world understands their sorrow more easily. But if someone is young, educated, loved, and connected to a famous family, people become confused by their suffering. Some even become cruel about it. They ask, "What did he have to be unhappy about?" That question sounds logical only to people who misunderstand the mind. Grief and inner collapse do not check a person's bank account before entering. They do not ask whether the apartment is elegant. They do not ask whether the family is famous. And they do not disappear because a last name is powerful. For Carter, the Vanderbilt legacy may have opened extraordinary doors. But no legacy, no matter how grand, can guarantee peace inside a human being. The more famous the family, the more invisible the private pain can become. Everyone looks at the name. Fewer people look at the person beneath it. And Carter was a person before he was a Vanderbilt, a son before he was an heir, a brother before he became a headline. The Vanderbilt name could open almost any door, but it could not open the locked room inside Carter Cooper. Gloria Vanderbilt was born into privilege, but not into peace. To the outside world, her name meant beauty, inheritance, society, and glamour. She was the Vanderbilt heiress, the girl whose life seemed destined to unfold inside the softest rooms America could offer. But Gloria's childhood was not soft. It was public, unstable, and shaped by adults fighting over her before she was old enough to understand what the world wanted from her. In the 1930s, her custody battle became national news. Newspapers turned a little girl's private life into public entertainment. They called her the poor little rich girl. The phrase sounded almost poetic, but beneath it was something cruel. A child with money, but without the simple protection of being left alone. That matters in Carter's story. Because Gloria Vanderbilt did not become a mother from a place of emotional innocence. She became a mother as someone who knew what it meant to be watched, judged, possessed, and discussed by strangers. She knew that wealth could surround a child and still fail to protect the child's heart. So when she had her sons, Carter and Anderson, family meant something profound to her. Carter was not just an heir in a famous line, he was her child. Anderson was not just another Vanderbilt descendant, he was her son. And Wyatt Cooper, their father, had given that family something Gloria had rarely known in her own early life: steadiness. But after Wyatt died, Gloria was left with two boys and a grief that could not be hidden by art, fashion, or society. This is where the story becomes more painful. Because Gloria loved her sons. That is not the question. By public accounts and by Anderson Cooper's later reflections, the bond between mother and sons was deep, complicated, and lasting. The question is not whether love existed. The question is whether love can always see clearly. A mother can adore her child and still not know the full shape of his suffering. A family can be close and still miss the private room inside one person's mind. A home can be filled with memories, books, paintings, and affection, and still contain silence no one knows how to translate. That is what makes Carter's story so unsettling. It does not fit the simple explanation people want. This was not a forgotten child in a cold mansion. This was not a young man with no family, no education, and no future. Carter had people who loved him. He had a mother who had already survived her own kind of emotional abandonment and wanted something better for her children. And still, something remained beyond reach. For Gloria, Carter's death would become the wound that never closed. But before that final wound, there had already been a lifetime of earlier ones: the custody battle, the public gaze, the loss of Wyatt, and the terrible knowledge that even a mother who had suffered deeply could not always protect her child from suffering. Perhaps that is why Carter's death was not only the loss of a son. For Gloria Vanderbilt, it may also have been the collapse of the dream she had fought hardest to build. A family safe enough that pain would not win. Carter Vanderbilt Cooper looked, from the outside, like a young man moving toward a meaningful life. He was intelligent, educated, thoughtful. Born into a famous family, but not remembered as someone who turned the family name into a performance. Available accounts describe him as serious, gentle, and deeply interested in ideas. He seemed more drawn to books and conversation than to the theater of wealth. He attended Princeton University and studied history. That detail matters. History is not only a subject, it is a way of looking at the world. A person drawn to history is often drawn to patterns, consequences, memory, and the question of how the past keeps shaping the present. For Carter, that must have been a complicated inheritance. His own family name was part of American history. The Vanderbilts were not just wealthy people in old photographs. They were part of the country's story of ambition, industry, power, excess, and decline. To carry that name was to carry a past that strangers felt entitled to interpret. But Carter was not simply a Vanderbilt descendant. He was a young man trying to become himself. After Princeton, he began working in publishing and editorial roles. That kind of work fit someone with a literary mind and a serious interest in culture. He was not rushing toward public celebrity. He was not turning his family name into a brand. From what is publicly known, he seemed to be building a quieter path. One connected to reading, thinking, and writing. And that is what makes this part of the story so haunting, because there is a kind of person who does not look like a warning sign. They graduate, they work, they answer questions, they appear composed, they can sit at dinner, speak politely, make others feel comfortable, and still be carrying something no one else can measure. Carter may have seemed like someone who would be fine because everything around him suggested he should be fine. He had a family, he had education, he had talent, he had a future that, from a distance, appeared open. But inner suffering does not always destroy the surface first. Sometimes it hides behind achievement, sometimes it hides behind manners, sometimes it hides behind the very qualities people admire. Sensitivity, intelligence, self-control, quietness. And if the people around that person are also grieving, also surviving, also trying to keep the family standing, the silence can become even harder to hear. Carter had already lost his father. Gloria had lost her husband. Anderson had lost the man who had anchored his childhood. Each of them was living inside the aftershock of Wyatt Cooper's death in a different way. So when Carter stepped into adulthood, he was not stepping into a clean beginning. He was stepping forward with family history behind him, a famous name above him, and a private inner life no camera, article, or public memory could fully capture. That is why it would be unfair to reduce him to the way his life ended. Before the tragedy, Carter was a son, a brother, a student, a reader, a young man with promise. But promise is not protection. And sometimes the people who seem closest to a bright future are the ones quietly losing sight of it. When people hear a story like Carter Cooper's, some of them ask the wrong question. They ask, how could someone like that suffer? Someone like that. A Vanderbilt descendant, Gloria Vanderbilt's son, Anderson Cooper's brother, Princeton educated, young, intelligent, and born into rooms most people would never enter. To many outsiders, Carter's life seems to violate the rules they have been taught about pain. People are used to believing that suffering belongs to visible hardship. Poverty, rejection, loneliness, failure, public disgrace. If a person has those things, the world understands their sorrow more easily. But if a person has beauty, family, education, money, and a famous name, the world becomes suspicious of their pain. That suspicion is one of the cruelest things about privilege. Because privilege can protect a person from many things, but it cannot protect them from being human. It can buy access to schools, doctors, travel, privacy, and comfort. It can place a young man inside elegant rooms and give him a last name that opens doors. But it cannot guarantee that he will feel safe inside his own mind. It cannot bring back a father. It cannot explain grief. It cannot always reach the part of a person that has learned how to hide. And sometimes privilege creates another kind of silence. If the world keeps telling you that you have everything, it may become harder to admit that something inside you is falling apart. You may feel guilty for your own sadness. You may feel ashamed that you are not grateful enough. You may begin to believe that your pain is not allowed because your life looks too fortunate from the outside. That is why Carter's story is so difficult to simplify. It is not a story about a young man who lacked love. It is not a story about a family that did not care. From what is publicly known, Carter was loved, Gloria loved him, Anderson loved him, Wyatt had loved him. The tragedy is not the absence of affection. The tragedy is that affection does not always come with the power to see everything. A family can love someone deeply and still not know the full shape of what he is carrying. A mother can be devoted and still miss the private language of her child's despair. A brother can share a childhood and still spend the rest of his life wondering what he did not see. That is the part Anderson Cooper would have to live with. Not just that Carter died young, but that Carter had been there, close enough to love, close enough to remember, close enough to imagine growing old beside, and still somehow unreachable in the final mystery of his suffering. People often want tragedy to make sense. They want a clean reason, a villain, a single mistake, a moment when everything could have changed. But some grief refuses to become that simple. Carter's life sat at the intersection of everything the world admires and everything the world still fails to understand. A famous name, a brilliant mind, a loving family, a hidden pain. And when those things exist together, the question becomes more frightening, not less. If all of that could not save him, what was happening inside Carter that no one could fully reach? One of the hardest truths about a mental health crisis is that it does not always arrive with a clear warning sign. Sometimes there are changes. Sometimes there are concerns. Sometimes a person begins seeking help, and the people around them understand that something is wrong. But even then, they may not understand how close the danger has become. That seems to be one of the most painful parts of Carter Cooper's story. By the summer of 1988, reports and family accounts suggested Carter had been struggling and had sought help. That detail matters, but it does not solve the mystery. It tells us something was wrong enough for concern. It does not tell us exactly what Carter felt. It does not tell us how deeply he was suffering. It does not tell us what was happening inside his mind in the final days of his life. And that is where responsible storytelling has to be careful. It would be easy to invent a reason. It would be easy to say the Vanderbilt pressure caused it, or the loss of his father caused it, or depression caused it, or medication caused it. But real human tragedy is rarely that clean. Gloria Vanderbilt would later look for explanations, as many grieving parents do. She needed something to hold on to, something medical, something external, something that could make the unthinkable feel less random. But a possible explanation is not the same as certainty. What we can say is that the people Carter left behind were forced to live with questions no family should have to carry. What did they miss? What could they have done? Was there a sign that seemed small at the time but became enormous afterward? Was there a moment when the outcome could have changed? These are the questions grief asks again and again. The cruel thing is that hindsight makes everything look different. After a tragedy, every conversation becomes evidence. Every quiet mood becomes a warning. Every ordinary detail begins to glow with meaning. Family members replay the past, not because they want to suffer, but because the mind keeps searching for an exit that no longer exists. Maybe if I had said this, maybe if I had noticed that, maybe if I had stayed closer, maybe if I had understood. But the living rarely get a complete map of another person's private pain. Even love has limits. Even memory has gaps. Even a mother standing close to her son may not know exactly what is happening inside him. That is not a failure of love. It is part of what makes mental suffering so frightening. Carter's family knew him as brilliant, gentle, educated, and loved. The world would later know him mostly through the tragedy of his death. But somewhere between those two versions was the real Carter. A young man with an inner life that no article, memoir, or family memory could fully recover. And then came July 22nd, 1988, a summer day in Manhattan. A day that began inside a family home and ended as the moment Gloria Vanderbilt would spend the rest of her life trying to understand. There are days a family survives, but never truly leaves. For Gloria Vanderbilt, July 22nd, 1988 became that kind of day. It was a summer day in Manhattan. Carter Cooper was 23 years old. He was young enough that his life should still have been mostly ahead of him. The unwritten work, the conversations he would never have, the decades his mother and brother would spend imagining instead of witnessing. By then, Carter's struggles had not been entirely invisible. Reports from the time said he had been under treatment for depression. But knowing that someone is in pain is not the same as knowing the exact moment when pain becomes danger. That is one of the cruelest truths about mental health crises. Families can be worried and still not know how urgent the danger has become. Gloria was there that day. That fact would become part of the wound. It is one thing to lose a child. It is another to be present in the final moments and then spend the rest of your life replaying them, searching for a door that no longer exists. What could I have said? What could I have done? Was there one sentence that might have changed everything? Those questions do not behave like ordinary thoughts. They return at night. They return during holidays. They return when a mother sees someone her son's age walking down the street. They return because grief, especially this kind of grief, does not want poetry. It wants an answer. But sometimes there is no answer that can hold the weight of what happened. Carter's death did not only end one life. It split the lives of those who loved him into a before and an after. Before, Gloria was a mother who had already known loss. The loss of childhood safety, the loss of privacy, the loss of Wyatt Cooper. After, she became a mother carrying the one loss no parent is built to carry. Before, Anderson Cooper was Carter's younger brother. After, he became the surviving brother, the one left to grow older with memories instead of shared birthdays, questions instead of phone calls, photographs instead of news stories. Anderson was not in the apartment that day, but absence does not protect a person from trauma. Sometimes not being there creates its own kind of torment. You are spared the sight, but not the imagination. You are spared the moment, but not the lifelong question of what your brother was feeling when no one could reach him. That is why this story should not be told as a shocking scene. It should be told as a family rupture. A young man died. A mother was shattered. A brother was changed. And a famous American name, with all its history and money and myth, proved helpless in the face of private darkness. From that day forward, Carter was no longer only a son and brother to the public. He became a tragedy. But to Gloria and Anderson, he remained something much more painful and much more human. He remained loved, he remained missed, and he remained the question neither of them could fully answer. After Carter Cooper died, Anderson Cooper did not simply lose a brother. He lost the person who should have been beside him for the rest of his life. That kind of loss does not stay in one room. It follows you into adulthood. It changes the questions you ask. It changes what feels important. It changes what feels unbearably shallow. Anderson would later become known for standing in the middle of disaster with a calm, controlled voice. Hurricanes, wars, mass suffering, human collapse. He built a career by going toward places most people would want to leave. But that choice did not come from nowhere. Anderson has spoken publicly about how early losses shaped him. The death of his father, the death of his brother, the feeling that the world was not safe in the way it once seemed. After experiencing deep loss, he became interested in questions of survival. Why do some people endure circumstances that others cannot? How do people keep living after the worst thing has already happened? That idea gives Carter's story a second life. Not because Carter should be reduced to his brother's career, but because grief often travels through the living in ways even they do not fully understand at first. Anderson did not choose the safest version of journalism. He did not simply step into a comfortable studio and inherit a public role. Early in his career, he went to dangerous places. He reported from conflict zones and humanitarian crises. He seemed drawn to the raw edge of human experience. Places where survival was not abstract. It was immediate. Seen through the lens of family loss, that choice becomes easier to understand. When someone close to you dies in a way that leaves no clear answer, the world can begin to feel unstable. You may start looking for places where suffering is visible. In a disaster zone, hunger is visible. Fear is visible. Death is visible. There is less pretending. Perhaps that is part of what pulled Anderson toward journalism. Not only danger, not only ambition, but a need to understand how human beings continue after everything familiar has been taken from them. Because that was the question his own family had been forced to face. How does a mother continue after losing her son? How does a brother continue after losing the person who shared his childhood? How does a family keep living when the explanation never comes? In later years, Anderson returned to these questions more openly. His podcast, All There Is, explores grief, death, and the strange work of living after loss. That is the part of grief many people misunderstand. It does not always vanish with time. Sometimes it changes shape. Sometimes it becomes work. Sometimes it becomes compassion. Sometimes it becomes the reason a person can sit with strangers in their worst moments and not look away. Carter was gone at 23. But in Anderson's life, his absence kept speaking. Not loudly, not always visibly, but in the questions Anderson asked, the places he went, and the way he came to understand that grief is not something people simply finish. For Anderson Cooper, Carter was not just the brother he lost. He was the loss that taught him to look directly at what most people spend their lives trying not to see. The Vanderbilt family left behind mansions, portraits, newspaper archives, old photographs, and a name that still sounds like American wealth. But Carter Vanderbilt Cooper left behind something different. He left behind a question. Not the kind of question history can answer with dates and records. Not the kind a biographer can solve by finding one more letter, one more interview, or one more forgotten detail. Carter left behind the kind of question that stays inside a family because it has no clean ending. Why? Why him? Why then? Why could no one stop it? For Gloria Vanderbilt, that question became part of the rest of her life. She had already survived a childhood turned into public spectacle. She had already lost Wyatt Cooper, the husband who helped give her a real sense of family. But losing Carter was different. It was not only grief. It was grief mixed with helplessness, memory, and the terrible instinct of a mother replaying the past again and again. For Anderson Cooper, the question became something else. It became part of the way he looked at the world. He would go on to build a life in journalism, standing close to loss, asking people how they survived what should have broken them. And maybe beneath all those questions, there was always another one. How does anyone continue after the person they love is gone? That is why Carter's story should not be remembered only as a tragedy in a famous family. It is easy to see the Vanderbilt name and think the lesson is simple. Money cannot buy happiness. But that phrase is too small for what happened here. It turns a human life into a slogan. Carter's story is more difficult than that. It reminds us that pain does not always look like pain from the outside. Intelligence is not protection. Education is not protection. Beauty, status, family history, and public admiration are not protection. Even love, as necessary as it is, does not always arrive with the power to see everything hidden inside another person. That is the most painful part. Carter was not unloved. He was not forgotten. He was not invisible in the ordinary sense. And yet, some part of his suffering remained unreachable. For the people left behind, that is often the wound that lasts longest. Not only the loss itself, but the sense that love came close and still could not save the person. So perhaps the real legacy of Carter Vanderbilt Cooper is not found in the Vanderbilt fortune. It is not found in old mansions or society pages. It is found in Gloria's grief, in Anderson's lifelong attention to loss, and in the uncomfortable truth his story leaves with everyone who hears it. Never assume someone is safe just because their life looks beautiful from the outside. Never assume a famous name, a good education, a loving family, or a comfortable home means a person is not fighting something silently. Sometimes the people who seem the most composed are the ones who have become experts at hiding their pain. And sometimes the most loving thing we can do is not to judge the surface of someone's life, but to ask, gently and honestly, what they are carrying beneath it. Carter Cooper was a son, a brother, a young man with a mind, a future, and people who loved him. He should not be reduced to the way his life ended. But if his story teaches anything, it may be this. Look more carefully at the people you think are fine, because even the grandest family name in America could not answer the question Carter left behind. And for those who loved him, that question never truly went away.